Thanks again for letting me be here this weekend. It was such a joy to get to come and worship with all of you. I had a wonderful time last night getting to worship and sing Amazing Grace and share a little bit about the history. And I'm really excited again this morning to first, as Jay just said, to share a little bit about the life of Newton during this time, and then talk about the theology of John Newton as we move over to the worship center and have our corporate worship this morning. I love this movie, Amazing Grace. Maybe you've seen it before. If you've not, you really should take the time to go out and rent it and watch this movie. It's a movie about William Wilberforce and the campaign to end slavery in 18th century England. And I think that the producers did a pretty good job portraying William Wilberforce, the lead guy in the story. But that movie, Amazing Grace, does a pretty terrible job of capturing John Newton. It just does. And for whatever reason, that seems to be pretty common. Last night, we had a chance to look at Newton's hymn writing, and in less than an hour, we're going to take a look at Newton's theology, which I believe was rather simple and straight to the point. He and his friend William Cooper wrote the only hymns, which is here behind me. There were about 350 hymns or thereabouts in that hymn book. And like I said, in a moment we're going to talk about his theology, which I think was rather simple and pretty straight to the point. But right now we have this short window to look at John Newton's life, and it's a remarkable story that really deserves to be well told. John Newton was born on July 24th, 1725. And though his mother was a devout believer who tried to point John to Jesus, even teaching her son to memorize Scripture, her death only weeks before John Newton's 7th birthday had a disastrous effect on her only child. There he is. His father was a rather irreligious sailor who spent most of his time away at sea and left little John Newton to figure out life for himself. He was sent off to boarding school for about 2 years after his mother died, and his father promptly remarried another woman who had very little affection towards her new stepson. She showed very little attachment towards John Newton. And at 10 years old, John Newton's formal education came to a close, and by the time he was 11 years old, he began sailing the seas with his father. Let that sink in. An 11-year-old boy. The next 7 years, John Newton was raised in large part on deck. Now, you can imagine the kinds of influences that Newton was being exposed to even as a small child. And this kid, he ran headlong into sin and into folly. It wasn't as though he completely forgot all of his mother's teaching and all of his mother's influence in those early years. So he vacillated for a while between morality and debauchery, but more often than not, license won out over legalism. You name it, John Newton was getting into it. And when he became of age, it was only natural that he would follow in his father's footsteps, and so John Newton became a sailor, as his dad had been. So when he was about 17 years old, his father tried to set him up with a really good job where he would be sailing off to Jamaica, but before they were about ready to push off, John Newton met a 13-year-old girl who would remain the object of his affection for the remainder of his long life. Her name was Mary Catlett, but John Newton used to call her Polly. Not sure where the connection there is, but there you go. He called her Polly. He stayed away a lot longer than he was supposed to. He missed his ship. He extended his stay because he was so taken with Polly. Missed his ship and ended up on a different vessel that would take him to Venice instead. These other sailors, to say the least, were not a good influence on John Newton. When he got back to England, the first thing that he wanted to do was go visit Polly again. I mean, he was smitten. And he pulled the same stunt that he had done the time before. He prolonged his visit, he missed his ship, and he was on shore once again with nothing to do. Now, in 18th century England, guys who were sitting around on their haunches could be gang pressed into naval service. And this is exactly what happened to John Newton. He became a Navy man, carousing with even more rough characters. And before long, he went absent without leave at least once in order to go see Polly again. In fact, one time, John Newton went absent without leave when he was on duty to ensure that no other sailors would go absent without leave. He was just a mess. And he did this, of course, to go visit his beloved Polly again. He was crazy about her. As a side note, that didn't stop him from being unfaithful and having all kinds of other escapades when he was away at sea and various sports and this sort of thing. But anyway, all of this craziness, all of this shirking off responsibility and authority landed John Newton in some hot water. He was stripped, whipped, and demoted. But John Newton was an absolute knucklehead. His superiors could not stand him, and when his ship came upon another Navy ship that needed men, one that was on the way to Africa, they were happy to hear that John Newton had volunteered to get on this other ship. Now, imagine, John Newton had a clean slate. He's passing from one ship to the next. An opportunity for him to start over. So what's he do? Well, we've already heard about his amazing songwriting skill. So John Newton decides to write a song to mock his new commander, and then he used his powers of influence and taught all the rest of the crew how to sing the song as well. He was proud. He mocked those that were in authority. He tried to steer people away from Christianity. He tried to entice other people into sin. He drank hard. He cussed, one might say, like a sailor. He was a jerk to everybody around him. He was given over to a sin. And so when he sought out a discharge from the Navy to work with a slave trader on the coast of Africa, they were quite happy to see John Newton go. What Newton didn't realize is that this slave trader had no intentions of treating John Newton as an employee, but instead he planned on treating John Newton as a slave. And so for the course of 18 months, John Newton himself was, for all intents and purposes, a slave himself. He was only given scraps of food to eat. Imagine that. And when his master would go ashore to do business, his master's mistress just hated him. Ever since the moment she laid eyes on him, she hated him. And so he would be chained to the deck of a ship while his master was ashore doing business upwards of 40 hours at a time, exposed to all kinds of weather. He was in such dire straits during this period of his life that African slaves took pity on John Newton, and they would sneak him food and this sort of a thing. He was in terrible, terrible shape. And John Newton might well have died there on the coast of Africa if his father had not been so connected in the seafaring world. He eventually snuck out a message to his dad, who found a friend who would go and fetch his son. By the time that they had arrived to pick up Newton, Newton had somehow gotten away from his master and almost decided not to take the ride back home. And it was on this vessel that was called the Greyhound. Now you would think that being enslaved for 18 months would grab a person's attention. It did not. And you would think that maybe being enslaved would make a person think twice about becoming a slave trader. Not for John Newton. He was so hard, so far from God in this early part of his life. His conscience was seared. He was blind, and he sinned with such flamboyance that his rescuer began to wonder, maybe I've taken a Jonah on board my ship. And perhaps he was right. Because on March 10th, 1748, a date that John Newton would never forget, a storm of biblical proportion overcame the ship upon which a man running from God was hiding. Now, just like Jonah, John Newton was below deck, asleep, when the storm began to rage. Isn't he just like Jonah? Just like Jonah. And as he was running up to help, he bumped into the captain, who told him to go back below deck and fetch a knife. Before he could grab the knife and get back up to his position on deck, the man in his place had been swept overboard by a wave. 20 out of the next 21 hours, John Newton pumped water out of the ship as almost every passing wave broke over his head. Other crew members were taking bedding to plug holes. They were taking buckets to scoop out water for 20 hours in hopes that they would not go down in the middle of the ocean. They were most of the way home on a 7,000-mile journey from Africa back to, they would land in Ireland eventually. And it was there, as John Newton was trying to pump water out of this ship, tied to the deck so that he would not be swept overboard, it was there when he was finally shaken to the core and realized how desperately he was a person in need of mercy. Now, he wasn't saved just yet. That would still be a while. But he would never forget this day for the rest of his life. In fact, he marked this day in his diary every year. This was the day when his eyes were open to his own need, his own desperate need for mercy, for grace. And even after the storm passed, the danger had not, because most of their provisions had been washed overboard, and the sails on that ship were in shreds, and they were stuck at sea. However, during that month, while they languished out there, John Newton did something remarkable, something he'd really never done as a young man before. He cracked open his Bible. Not saved, but God was doing something in his heart. And when the ship finally made it home safely, the first thing that John Newton did was to go find Polly, and he proposed marriage to her. But if John Newton was going to get married, John Newton needed a job. And so he was delighted to be appointed first mate upon the Brownlow, which was a slave ship. Now this here behind me is a model of the slave ship that William Wilberforce showed Parliament to demonstrate how many slaves could be packed in a ship for the journey across the Middle Passage. It's absolutely atrocious. Let's not skim over this. What John Newton did as a slave trader is about as callous and awful as you can imagine. Jonathan Aiken, who I referred to last night, in his biography, wonderful biography of John Newton, describes it this way. He says, tearing husbands away from their wives and children, shackling these screaming men in heavy fetters, and chaining them in horrific, overcrowded squalor that would have disgraced the animal pens of an abattoir, a slaughterhouse, were routine tasks for the ship's mate of a slave trading ship. It's likely that Newton carried out all of them. It's pretty awful. Some contend that Newton even sexually abused the women who were on board. We don't know. He might well have done that, if not at this point, earlier on in his story. But we do know that over the course of this short life of his, he had been involved in some of the darkest things you could possibly imagine. Human trafficking, witchcraft, black magic, heavy drinking, sexual sin, abuse, foul language, pride, deliberately leading people away from the faith, you name it. He was sliding into some awful things, his first mate on this slave ship, when Newton came down with a violent fever. It was bad. I think he thought perhaps he was going to die. And it was this brush with death that finally got his attention. And as I read his autobiography, and I know some of you have read it as well, as I read his autobiography, I think that it's at this point that John Newton was truly born again. Now, that makes some people a bit nervous when we look at the chronology of his life, because he started to change in all kinds of ways. He left off cussing, he left off womanizing and blaspheming, but he did not leave off slave trading. In fact, he went from being a first mate on a slave ship to being a captain. It was 1750, John Newton was 25 years old, a new husband, a new believer, and the captain of a slave ship. But God was doing something here. There was new life. And though he was still blinded to the atrocities of the slave trade, there was now a hunger in him to know God and follow God. He felt like slavery was just how the world worked. And his primary obligation in his mind was just to be humane to those slaves that were aboard his ship. In fact, he had one ship where he did not lose a single person while at sea, while other ships were losing regularly a third, perhaps even up to a half of the slaves that were on board the slave ship in the Middle Passage. During this time, John Newton began holding worship services on the ship while they were out at sea, sometimes officiating himself. Curiously, he even spoke of his tenure aboard a slave ship as some of the sweetest moments of communion that he ever had with God. Now, over time, John Newton grew to hate the slave trade with a passion. And it seems to me that Newton was almost embarrassed by his pleasant memories of those days. And he tries to set the record straight in later publications. He wrote later on, "Disagreeable I had long found it, but I think I should have quitted it sooner had I considered it, as I do now, to be unlawful and wrong. But I never had a scruple upon this head at the time, nor was such a thought once suggested to me by any friend." He would take 2 more voyages as captain of a slave ship. He recalled, "I was sometimes shocked with an employment that was perpetually conversant with chains, bolts, and shackles. In this view, I had often petitioned in my prayers that the Lord in his own time would be pleased to fix me in a more humane calling." Well, God answered those prayers by a severe mercy. 2 days before setting sail on his 4th journey as a slave ship captain, John Newton had a seizure that lasted for an entire hour. His days as a slaver were over. It had been almost 6 years since that day when he almost died out at sea. And in August of 1755, Newton landed a new job, and he really began to grow in his faith. During this period, he was in Liverpool, he was a tide surveyor, and he was a sponge. He began traveling to London all the time in order to take in sermons. Every Sunday, he'd listen to 4 different preachers. If that weren't enough, Newton tried to attend worship on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays as well. He was 30 years old, starting fresh. And over time, he began to see how sinful and how horrid the slave trade actually was. His connections and correspondence began expanding rather rapidly during this period as well. Several of these acquaintances were quite noteworthy. Newton was introduced in the summer of 1755 to George Whitefield, and the two became close friends and correspondents. In fact, Newton followed Whitefield around so much during this period that he earned himself the nickname Young Whitefield or Little Whitefield. Whitefield, of course, was the greatest evangelist of the Great Awakening, which is perhaps the most powerful movement of God's Spirit in the last 300 years. Whitefield was such a powerful preacher. In fact, it was said that he could make a whole crowd burst into tears just by saying the word Mesopotamia, and then everybody, Jesus save me, which of course is nonsense. But he was a powerful, powerful preacher. Newton at this time also became friends with John and Charles Wesley. John there on the left was the great organizer, and then Charles, of course, was the great hymn writer of that same movement, the Great Awakening. On his birthday in the year 1758, John Newton officially committed himself to the work of ministry, spending 11 hours in prayer and fasting and committing himself to the Lord, saying, "I'm all yours. I'm all yours, Jesus. Use me." Now, his first few sermons were a train wreck. Likely in an attempt to mimic Whitefield, the first time out, John Newton tried preaching without any notes. And that wasn't good. In the middle of it, he forgot his sermon in the middle of it, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to end it up, and the resident pastor had to get up and finish out the sermon for him. Next go around, John Newton made sure he wouldn't make that same mistake, so he wrote out every single word that he would say, and then he just stared at his notes and read it out to the crowd. It took a while, for him to find his way in terms of preaching. Now, his life story was so crazy that people began to ask him if he would write it down, and that was how, at the age of 39, John Newton came to pen his autobiography. Little did he know at this time that this would be the instrument that God would use to get him his first pastorate. It was called an authentic narrative. John Newton had looked all over trying to find a ministry position for several years. He'd been waiting. In fact, 7 years he tried to find a position, could not find one, and finally in the year 1764, Newton was invited to take the curacy of the Anglican Church there in Olney. Olney, England. A man by the name of Lord Dartmouth had read Newton's story and was so taken by it that he offered Newton a job there. I had the joy of getting to go visit Olney a couple of different times, walk through it. That's actually where John Newton is buried today. He had been buried originally in London, but when they put the tubes through the city, they had to reinterment his body, and they moved it to Olney, England. At any rate, after landing this job, his life begins to change in a significant way. This is the second half, really, of Newton's amazing story. The first half was pretty tumultuous, and the last half was relatively stable and steady. Now, it was at Olney, as I shared last night, that he began collaborating with a man named William Cowper in order to write hymns, and that's how the song Amazing Grace came to be. And it was also after he became the pastor here at Olney that John Newton became friends with this couple right up here, whose names were William and Hannah. They had no children of their own, but they were devout Christians, and they welcomed Newton into their home on numerous occasions for him to preach and teach. They would do things, they called it parlor preaching. So, if somebody had a big parlor and a famous preacher lived around, he'd go around and you'd gather your friends. It's kind of like think of a Christmas gathering outreach kind of a thing. You bring your favorite pastor in and he preaches to all your neighbors and shares the gospel with them. Well, Newton would do that kind of thing with William and Hannah. And once when Newton was there, he met a little boy. It's their nephew. And he had come to live with his aunt and uncle. His name was William Wilberforce. John Newton was in his 40s when the two met, and Wilberforce was only 10 years old, but Newton, for whatever reason, took a shine to little Wilbur, and their relationship would take on a significance of epic proportion in later years. This isn't necessarily widely held, but I think it was John Newton who first told William Wilberforce about slavery. I can just see this overweight pastor, this guy who used to prefer his old blue sea jacket over traditional ministerial garb, entertaining little Wilberforce with stories of his adventures while on the high seas. I have no idea how else to account for the fact that William Wilberforce, not more than 14 years of age, would write a letter to the editor expressing his hatred of the slave trade. Sadly, when William Wilberforce's mother learned of this methodistical or evangelical influence that was corrupting her small child, she immediately fetched for little Wilbur and wanted to bring him back home. And she did all that she could do in order to distract Wilberforce from pursuing any kind of spirituality. And it would be some 15 years before John Newton and William Wilberforce would cross paths again. Meanwhile, Newton's influence continued to expand. In addition to writing songs with William Cooper, he started writing letters to other people. And his letter writing became so renowned, and because these letters were so spiritually helpful, that he began to gather them up, and then he would publish collections of those letters as books. Even more, as a pastor, he would tend to the poor in his parish. Olney was a small town composed mostly of poor lace makers. Many of them were too poor to even afford a Bible for themselves. Imagine that. You're so poor you can't afford a Bible. He would visit those that were in prison. He gave away bread to those who were hungry. He took collections for the needy. One time, Newton was a funny guy. I mean, sometimes, his heart's in the right place, but you wonder about the wisdom of his methodology. One time he bought a lottery ticket in hopes that if he won, he could give the money away to all the poor in his community. Didn't work out. Moreover, during this period, he starts befriending all kinds of people and mentoring them. And I believe this might well have been his greatest legacy, perhaps even greater than the song Amazing Grace. The list of people that John Newton discipled and what they went on to do is simply mind-boggling. He would visit 3 to 4 families every afternoon and held children's meetings in the church every Thursday in order to catechize them. And in a rural parish like Olney here, he typically had 50 to 70 children that he would minister to. 50 to 70. For a while, again, you can question his methodology, but for a while he tried to bribe kids because he wanted to get more to come. And so he had a little, some money he would give away to them. And before the money ran out, he had 200 kids coming regularly. That was a hit, As you might imagine, he also preached and he prayed. In addition to Sundays, he had midweek services for both preaching and praying. In fact, their Tuesday evening prayer meeting grew to such an extent that he had to move it to a room that would hold 130 people. 2 waves of revival swept through his church. 100 people experienced awakening. One of his only hymns took the form of a prayer. It goes like this: "And may the gospel's joyful sound, enforced by mighty grace, awaken many sinners round to come and fill the place." That prayer was answered. People beyond his parish began to recognize Newton as a unique and gifted spiritual leader. And because of his own journey, he was incredibly skilled as a shepherd of people's souls. This guy with such a checkered past had a wonderful sense of life and joy and humor, as well as sage-like wisdom. And the ability to tend souls with an uncommon finesse and discernment. He was friendly and he was bright. Though his formal education had stopped when he was only 10 years old, he was self-taught in mathematics, the classics, Greek, and Hebrew. He adored his wife, Polly. At times he felt that he probably worshipped her, that he idolized her. And though they had no children of their own, John Newton would adopt 2 of their nieces who had been orphaned. Newton had a deep sense, in his own words, of God's goodness and my own vileness. That's a theme we see over and over in his writings. As an old man, he would say, "For 40 years past, I have thought every waking hour on my former misery." Newton's past haunted him in some ways. Yet grace abounded where there had once only been shame. Frankly, he was a magnet to the people around him. People gravitated towards him because of his warmth and his cheerfulness, his genuine humility, and his deep gratitude for all of God's kindnesses towards him all of those years. And unlike the character who portrayed Newton in that movie, Amazing Grace, the real John Newton, the John Newton of history, was an incredibly joyful man. Not some guy slopping a mop around alone, isolated in a cathedral somewhere. He was incredibly joyful, surrounded by people who were clamoring for him to invest in their lives. And so when some politics surrounding the American Revolution caused a little bit of discord in his parish, John Newton began to wonder whether he was losing a bit of influence amongst his own people. And it wasn't entirely surprising that after 16 years of serving at Olney, he would seriously consider it when offered a position to become only the 2nd evangelical Anglican to lead a church in the heart of London, to lead a congregation in the heart of London. It's only the 2nd evangelical Anglican to do that in that period. And that's how John Newton came in the year 1780 to pastor St. Mary Woolnoth. There it is on the left, as it looked about the year 1780 in London. And there on the right is his pulpit. I had the great honor of getting to stand in that. We have a picture of me standing in Newton's old pulpit there from this past summer. St. Mary Woolnoth is in the banking district of London, right in the heart of the city. It's funny that the facility really isn't that large. On the floor you could seat maybe 120, 140 people. It used to have a gallery all around the top as well that he would pack out. But still, in this relatively small church, under his leadership, this would become ground zero for all kinds of evangelistic and missionary and compassionate ministry initiatives. I mean, it's amazing what took place. And there's a whole lot that we could talk about or point out over the next 28 years of John Newton's life. Various ministries that he helped establish while serving there at St. Mary Woolnoth. But the one aspect of this period that I would like to point out while his influence was at its peak is how John Newton mentored so many people just through friendship. Maybe you've heard of William Carey before. Have you heard of William Carey? Carey's known as the father of modern missions. When he wanted to go as a missionary to India, it was illegal for him to go there because of the East India Company charter. Do you know who he sought out for advice? John Newton. John Newton said, well, hey, if God has something for you there, nobody can stop you. And if he doesn't, then you have nothing to lose. You might as well give it a crack. So Carey snuck into the country even though it was illegal, and the rest is history. We now refer to Carey as the father of modern missions. Next slide. You've probably never heard of Richard Johnson before. But I bet you do recall that Australia used to be, was originally intended as a penal colony. Do you know who encouraged Richard Johnson to get on a fleet along with his brand new bride? Basically, it was their honeymoon. To get on a fleet with 750 convicts? What a honeymoon. We're going to go on a cruise for our honeymoon. With 750 convicts on their way to an untamed land so that I might serve as the first chaplain on that continent. Do you know who influenced him to do that? Who recruited him? Newton. You guessed it. You might not know at the time, but in London, this period, 1/4 of all unmarried women were prostitutes. Do you know who led Thomas Scott to faith? The guy who ended up starting an institution in the heart of London to protect these women from being preyed upon? Yeah, John Newton. Or who trained the guy who helped start the Foreign Bible Society? Or who took in the wanderer who in time would basically write the precursor to Operation World? or who designed a seminary and recruited his friend to lead it that would train more than 100 pastors over the next 65 years? Or what about that little boy? Remember that little boy that I showed you a picture of a moment ago? On a December day in 1785, John Newton received a note from William Wilberforce as he was struggling with his faith. And it read, "Sir, there is no need of apology for intruding on you when the errand is religion. I wish to have some serious conversation with you, and will take the liberty of calling on you for that purpose in half an hour, when, if you cannot receive me, you'll have the goodness to let me have a letter put in my hands at the door, naming a time and place for our meeting. The earlier, the more agreeable to me. I've had 10,000 doubts within myself, whether or not I should discover myself to you. But every argument against doing so has its foundation in pride. I'm sure you'll hold yourself bound," listen to this, "to let no one living know of this application, or of my visit till I release you from the obligation. P.S. Remember that I must be secret, and that the gallery of the House of Commons, is now so universally attended that the face of a member of Parliament is pretty well known." It was pretty clandestine. I suppose that Wilberforce could have made a decent spy. He circled the block a couple of times before going to see Newton. He wanted no one to know what he was doing. They had not seen each other in 15 years. But their friendship picked up as though not a day had passed. Wilberforce wanted to know, among other things, he was feeling like God was doing something in him, and both his conversion and a struggle with a call to ministry was all happening at the same time. And Wilberforce wondered, should I leave politics in order to enter into the ministry? John Newton encouraged him, stay at your post in Parliament and be a force for good there. Around a year and a half later, after spending a day with John Newton, William Wilberforce wrote in his diary with grave conviction, "God Almighty," there's his diary right there, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." Soon after, Wilberforce announced his intention to introduce a bill to Parliament to abolish the slave trade. Immediately after Wilberforce's announcement, John Newton's work, Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade, hit the press. They had planned together that Newton's book would come out immediately after Wilberforce's intentions to introduce a bill into Parliament. John Newton argued that the slave trade was nothing less than a flagrant sin against a holy God, and a copy was sent to every member of both houses of Parliament. And Newton was called to give his first-hand account before a council that was headed up by the Prime Minister, William Pitt Jr. himself. And he followed up this testimony with another and wrote some other letters. Now, John Newton had been preaching against the slave trade for some time. But now Wilberforce was leading the charge for abolition through political channels. Little did they know when the campaign started how long it would take to see it through. It would be a 20-year battle for the abolition of the trade. And then, after 1807 till 1833-34, it would be however long that is until the abolition of the institution of slavery itself. It's a long battle. And when the victory for the abolition of the trade was all but in the bag, the elderly John Newton applauded Wilberforce on his upcoming triumph. He wrote, "Though I can scarcely see the paper before me, I must attempt to express my thankfulness to the Lord and offer my congratulations to you for the success which He has so far been pleased to give to your unwearied endeavors for the abolition of the slave trade." Newton had gone from degenerate slave to hardened slaver to Christian abolitionist. What a life. I can only imagine how overjoyed Newton was to hear that on February 23rd, 1807, the House of Commons voted 283 to 16 to abolish the slave trade. He had published his thoughts upon the African slave trade 19 years earlier, and one person after another gave speeches in the House of Commons until at the end of the evening, one man stood up and compared William Wilberforce and Napoleon. And as one author describes it, he says that Napoleon, would go home with all of his pomp and so on and so forth, but not really beloved by anyone. And yet Wilberforce would go home with this humble, simple kind of welcoming, but this warm welcome from a beloved family. And then after he gave his speech, the House of Commons, he writes, rose to nearly a man, turned to Wilberforce, and began to cheer. The chamber was swept again and again with sustained applause. Wilberforce sat with his head bowed and wept. 10 months later, December 23rd, 1807, John Newton's time on earth would be done. And the Times reported Newton's death, died. At his house in Coleman Street Buildings, aged 82, the Reverend John Newton, rector of the United Parishes of St. Mary Woolnoth and St. Mary Woolchurch Hall, of which parishes he'd been rector for 28 years. His unblemished life, his amiable character, both as a man and as a minister, and his able writings are too well known to need any comment. I think it's many years of respectability and kind, humble service had made it easy for people to gloss over those early days when Newton lived anything but a life without blemish. Newton was a self-described, wild creature whom the Lord in a measure tamed and brought from Africa to stand as a memorable proof that His mercy can pardon the most atrocious wickedness and His grace can change the most obstinate habits of sin.